Days That Will Never Come Again. Chapter 6, First Part. When Dee entered the hospital, he was greeted by the stark emptiness of the hallways, and the white lighting that made it look as still as the bottom of a lake. "Welcome," someone said from behind him. Turning, the hunter found a nurse standing there. "Director Allen is waiting for you. Allow me to show you the way." Giving a slight bow, she walked ahead of Dee. Dee followed after her. "You know, I had a dream about you too," the nurse said. Dee didn't respond. The nurse probably hated him as well. Dee was the enemy of all who wanted to continue living in this world. Even here in a world where they'd once been fond of the nobility, there was no place for him. The two of them got in the elevator. In no time, they arrived at the bottom floor. A hallway devoid of life seemed to continue on without end under the harsh white lights. The nurse's footsteps were the only sound that rang through the stagnant air. Just as the sound of them stopped, the scene around Dee grew distorted. It was full of light. Natural light. What kind of power did one need to turn a subterranean passageway at night into a field in the daylight? The world was covered with a green so lush it seemed to saturate his eyes. A young man and young lady raced across the plains, apparently headed toward the forest. The sunlight and green grass bestowed their blessings on the couple. The magnanimous will of nature seemed to bid all the joyful things in the world to serve the youthful lovers. The young lady turned. It was Sybil. The boy turned as well. Strong traces of the sheriff's face were visible. Laughter could be heard. Anyone would love to have such a dream. Dee was standing in the forest. A bittersweet odor invaded his nose, and the trees were awash with crimson. It was late autumn. Ripe apples rolled by his feet. Chasing after them, Sybil dashed right at Dee, passing through his body like a ghost. The sweet product of life drooped from the branches of every tree, sparkling red in the light borne on the wind. Farmers with baskets on their backs smiled as they watched Sybil, and then walked away. Tonight, there'd surely be fat slices of apple pie on the dinner table. Once again the scene changed. The distant ringing of a bell shook the falling snowflakes. Figures in black overcoats, grouped in twos and threes, lined up and filed into the mere skeleton of a building. It appeared to be the frame for a community hall. Inside were Sheriff Crutz and Sybil. Dr. Allen was there too, and off to the side stood Eileen and old Mrs. Sheldon. Snow struck their faces and dyed their overcoats white. The pale lace patterns it left weren't quick to melt. All present exhaled white plumes as they listened with gleaming eyes to speeches by the mayor and the principal, and then prayed for the future of their village. Gradually the village grew larger. Old folks died, children grew up, clouds rolled by, old houses were rebuilt. Damage due to malfunctioning weather controllers was close to non-existent here. Very few people perished from accidents. On evenings in the spring, little girls changed into white dresses. Children ran with fireworks in hand and left a rainbow of sparks in their wake, like some fantasy. Everyone hastened down the main street to the site of the dance party, being held at the vacant lot. Oddly enough, Sybil didn't dance even once, but sat enviously watching the men and women cavorting with their partners in the moonlight. The young sheriff danced with Eileen, but as they danced he looked at Sybil. Eileen sadly pressed her cheek to the lawman's chest. the village was peaceful. Dee was in the cemetery. White gravestones and orderly rows paid respect to those now gone. And as twilight drew near, the children visited and called out the names of those interred there. When a bit more time had passed and the last remnants of the day vanished, deep blue shadows rose from under the gravestones, and then the shadows joined hands with the children to form a big circle, and recounted with pleasure tales of the nobles' world, showing the villagers graceful dances, quite unlike their own, and teaching them how to make apple pies. From time to time, one of them would be pained with thirst, so one of the villagers would cut their wrist without any reluctance at all, catching the crimson fluid in an empty milk bottle, and delivering it while it was still fresh. Here, consideration and coexistence and sympathy ruled the scene. An ideal had become reality. It was a dream, however, a dream where the dreamer mustn't awaken. A faint voice reached his ears. This particular voice always sounded so sad. "Why have you come?" it asked. But not with words, just with a question. "Why have you come here? This is a peaceful village. Isn't this what you always had in mind?" Dee didn't reply. He stood like a beautiful and intricately worked statue. Eyes beyond numbering stared at him. The sheriff, the hospital director, old Mrs. Shelton, the hotel manager, countless other men, women, and children, and those with pale skin and ivory fangs. And Sybil, too. "Remain here," the pale one said. "Live here in peace. No one will shun you here. This is the world we made. This is the world he made." "That's right," Dee said, responding at last. "It was made by drinking the blood of a girl. What about her?" "That can't be helped. This is a beautiful village, and that was her dream." "Perhaps it was his dream. The girl called me here. She hasn't told me what my job entails yet." "And do you intend to take it?" "I don't know." "You are a vampire hunter. Don't concern yourself with this." A mysterious spark resided in Dee's eyes. "You're right, I am," he said. Perhaps some deeper emotion lay behind those words. The intent gazes of the villagers that were trained on him accusingly suddenly froze, then glittered brighter than ever. A heartbeat later, his surroundings were masked by pitch darkness. All that was left was Dee, and one other person, the hospital nurse. "Would you lead the way?" Dee said to her softly. The nurse turned around. She had Sybil's face. "Leave, Dee. Just leave the village," she said. "Everything will be fine then." "Which Sybil are you?" "I am myself. Please. If you do anything, I'll cease to exist in this world. Don't say anything or do anything. Just leave." Dee began to walk slowly. Dee. Sybil's expression changed. Dee walked away again. Page break. "Damn it, he's here." "Your brain manipulations don't seem to be doing the trick, and things are starting to get hairy," old Mrs. Shelton said. "What do we do?" asked Eileen. "We'll just leave it all to this world," Dr. Allen replied. "But this all originally sprang from Sybil's dreams. Can it break free of her?" "I don't know," the director said. "After all, Sybil is putting up an awful lot of resistance." The crystal shards that made up part of the machine gave off pale purple beams of light. Page break. As Dee calmly walked away, the nurse swung at his back with her right hand. A knife she produced from somewhere glittered there. Before her blade had moved more than a few inches, a flash of silver slashed through her svelte torso. The nurse faded away too. Even Dee couldn't tell whether he was a product of this world, or a phantasm, conjured up by someone manipulating Sybil's brain. Once more the hallway stretched on forever. Dee halted. A number of doors were lined up on a wall that shouldn't have had any. He opened the closest one. The image of Sybil floated in the darkness. "Leave our village," she said. Dee closed the door without saying a word. He then opened the next door. His surroundings were masked by a thick white fog that clung to his skin. "Watch yourself now," his left hand said. "I can't quite analyze the components of this stuff. There are dream enzymes mixed in it." Dee looked over his shoulder. The hallway was fading into the mist. Direction was ceasing to exist. Dee advanced toward where the door had been. There was a slight creaking sound. Quickly enough, he remembered that familiar sound as old Mrs. Sheldon rocking back and forth in her favorite chair. As she came into view, he saw she had a gray blanket on her lap, a tray with a teapot, and steaming cups balancing on top of it. Dee noticed that the steam they gave off took the color of the sky as it rose in the air. And this was all probably an illusion, too. Dee's left hand was a blur of action. A needle of unfinished wood seemed to sprout from the left side of the old woman's chest. It had been thrown by Dee. With the tiniest sound, she collapsed in her rocking chair. The old woman's body then disappeared. "Seems whoever it is isn't as powerful as the dreamer," the hunter's extended left hand said. "Still, you can't let your guard down. If we get taken out, it might mean more than us just vanishing. Here it comes." By it, the voice meant the bluish smoke spreading through the air that was heading for them. No sooner had Dee held his breath than the smoke dropped, like it had real weight, and crushed around his upper body. A flash of silver shot out. 2 silvery slashes formed a cross that quartered the blue smoke, but it quickly fused together again, and rushed through the air in pursuit of Dee as he leapt away. Trying to leap again, Dee found his feet stuck to the ground. Old Mrs. Sheldon lay on the floor, and she had a grip on the hunter's ankles. Dee's upper body turned blue. He could feel the smoke seeping in through his skin. The wind howled as the blue smoke became a single stream that was sucked into Dee's left hand. In less than a second, the world of white had returned. His left hand coughed. On the surface of his palm, a human face swiftly formed. "Shit," it gasped. "Damn smoke. Probably shouldn't have swallowed that." "It worked by osmosis," Dee said, not seeming the least bit upset. "I'm analyzing it now, so keep your pants on. I'm gonna have to try breaking the dream down to the elementary particle level." Just then the voice gagged, and the tiny mouth disgorged blue smoke. It almost looked like he was blowing out a long drag from a cigarette. Mingling with the white fog, the smoke soon vanished. "I've got it. This stuff is..." Suddenly, the cries of Dee's left hand were interrupted by a bizarre chill, enveloping the hunter's frame. With a sickeningly loud tearing sound, furry tentacles burst out all over his body. A monster within him, created, perhaps, by the combination of the smoke and the blue-petaled tea the old woman had given him before, was being born. Wriggling tentacles ruptured Dee's chest, stomach, and face. The back of his head flew off, and something that looked like a cross between a spider and a scorpion peered out. Dee's left hand grabbed the creature about the neck. It was like a vision of hell. With just one hand, Dee yanked out the creature that had formed in his body. Flesh ripped and bone snapped. As the creature plopped to the ground, Dee's longsword split its brain in two. Dee stood there impassively. "Well, I must say, I'm downright amazed at your power today," someone said with admiration. "If you weren't fully aware this world is no more than a dream, I fancy you'd be in a body bag right now." Dee turned around completely. There was no trace of the old woman, but Dee perceived her presence, despite the fact that she couldn't be seen. Not at all ruffled, Dee began to walk. Even as he made his way through the fog, he maintained his impressive good looks. After taking a few steps, he halted. Ai Ling stood before him. "Dee," she said. He couldn't tell if she shouted or whispered. Nevertheless, Dee continued walking once more. "Wait, I'm the same Ai Ling you met before." Hers was a sorrowful cry. Surely it was painful that she even had to say this, living with a husband who'd fallen for her best friend. Stoically defending her home and family, even though she knew her husband still loved the other girl. What had become of this woman's true nature? Was this just a role she played? "Step aside," Dee said softly. "I have to go see Sybil." "Stay here in the village, or forget about seeing her and just leave." "Tell Sybil to let me," the hunter replied. "If you'll stay here in our village, in our world, I'll always—" Dee kept walking. Ai Ling didn't move. Putting his hand to her shoulder, Dee pushed her out of the way. It was a gentle nudge that wasn't like the young man. There was a door behind him. "Dee," Ai Ling mumbled behind him. "Kill me." Dee grabbed hold of the doorknob. Behind him, the air stirred violently, and he went into action. Ai Ling had a knife in her right hand and had tried to stick the hunter with it, but Dee grabbed her wrist with his left hand. "I'm begging you, Dee," she said. "Please, just kill. Can't die on our own, you see. This world just brings me back to life. But if you were to cut—" Dee, the bringer of death, made a motion with his black-gloved hand, and Ai Ling fell to the floor. By the time low sobs spilled from her, the young man in black had disappeared through the door. He hadn't so much as glanced at the hysterical woman. He was in the feeble darkness of the hospital room. Next to the bed sat a device, and next to that stood the hospital director. "Here at last," Dr. Allen said happily. He wasn't talking about the hunter. Dee turned around. Two figures appeared on the far side of the room. A huge man sitting on a horse and a little man lying on the back of a black panther. Though the room was small, there was more than enough space between them and the hunter. "Dee, I take it. We've heard talk about you," the man on the horse said. The ring of fear in his voice was probably due to his believing the talk they'd heard. "I'm Harold B., the senior bio brother. That there's my kid brother. Duncan B. is the name." The eyes of the little man and the panther brimmed with unearthly hostility as they looked up at Dee. "We meet at last. We don't mind if we get destroyed," Harold said from over by the window. "Of course, if you take us down here, it looks like we'll be brought right back to life anyway." I don't suppose you're going to turn around after all this and say you'll just settle down all peaceful-like in the village now, will you? Harold brought his left hand to the breast pocket of his coat, pulled out something shiny, and tossed it at Dee's feet. It was a silver star. In a heartbeat, the entire room froze. The director, the brothers, and even the Black Panther all saw something there, so terrifying that it made their hair stand on end. Dee's eyes gave off a blood light, and the instant it faded, the panther leapt without making a sound. Bisecting the animal with the silvery flash that shot up from below, Dee held his long sword at the ready again. Just now, the panther's body had offered no more resistance than cutting through thin air. Instantly the Black Panther was over by the wall again, its eyes wildly ablaze with the lust for killing. A moment later, the two halves of its bisected torso were connected again. Both the man on the horse and the one on the panther smirked. When the front half of the panther thudded to the floor, however, Harold's eyes filled with the first real look of fear. "You son of a..." moaned the little man who tied his own life, or at least his upper body, to that of his beloved beast. Not even bothering to look at the little man, Dee leveled his longsword at the man on the horse. "One-on-one won't be easy for you," the hunter said in a low voice. Harold gave a little nod. "Yep. We must have been out of our minds, I suppose, to throw down with vampire hunter Dee, of all people." "Hold on there. It still ain't over yet." Duncan groaned from the floor. Copious amounts of dark red blood gushing from his wound, he dragged himself toward Dee. The sword the little man held in his right hand was proof enough he hadn't given up the fight yet. Dee advanced smoothly, not toward Harold, but rather toward Duncan. Those foe could do no more than crawl. The hunter's cruel blade came down at an angle, decapitating not only Duncan, but his Black Panther as well. Without a moment's delay, Dee leapt into the air and thrust his gore-stained blade right through Harold's chest. As the huge man dropped helplessly, the hunter lopped off his head. The geysers of blood didn't erupt from the wounds until a second after Dee landed again. Intensely silent, Dee turned to the hospital director. "So that finishes it, then?" said Dr. Allen. "You are one fearsome character, to be sure. Exactly what we'd expect from the one chosen to save our princess from her eternal slumber." "I can't wake her up," Dee told him flatly. "All I want to know is what I'm supposed to do. Give this Sybil back her dream." "If I refuse, will you cut me down?" The hunter didn't reply. The hospital director soon nodded. His hair was standing on end. "This may be a dream, but still," Dr. Allen said. "Gotta be afraid to die." The hunter watched as the man reached for the machine with both hands. A second later, a burning hot blade ran into Dee's back and out through his chest. Turning, he met Harold's face, which was plastered with a hideous grin. "Too bad, eh?" Harold said with a wink. "And, you know, I ain't the only one still kicking. My kid brother's fit as you please, too." The panther head on the floor bared its fangs, and the two halves of its torso balanced uneasily on two legs each. Of course, part of Duncan remained on top of all three pieces. "The two of us are a product of some science from thousands of years ago. What they called biotechnology," the older brother explained. "See, we were made to be different. Right down at the cellular level, namely, like this." As he said that, Harold thrust his chest forward. It was literally as if he'd shed his skin. A semi-translucent Harold broke free of his body, floating a few feet in front of the spot where his physical body stood, and then, almost simultaneously, this new form took the color and texture of his original body, and then his original body suddenly lost its color and substance, becoming like the reflection of a statue in a pool before disappearing without a sound. Pulling these false images from his actual body, he could produce copies of himself. Perhaps even Dee hadn't imagined his opponent could form doppelgangers like this. Harold B. used these false images to confuse his foes, while his real body crept around behind them, and brought down a lethal blow with his weapon. His younger brother, on the other hand, had vastly accelerated cellular activity. As a result of this, his limbs could continue to function even after they were severed from his body, and he could fuse with other living creatures to make them do his bidding. Who could hope to be a match for these brothers? "End of the road, Hunter," the older brother said. Perhaps knowing something of Dee's nature, Harold didn't pull out the blade he'd run through the hunter, but rather drew another one and lashed out with that. A heartbeat later, the arm wielding the new blade fell to the floor, severed at the shoulder. Realizing Dee had accomplished this with his sword without turning, and with the blade still stuck through his heart, Harold sputtered, "You son of a... You're no plain old Dampier, are you?" With one hand clamped down on his shoulder, while fresh blood gushed from the wound, Harold shook all over with pain and rage. The only reason he managed to avoid the full damage of the flash of silver that zipped through the air was because Dee was fighting with a knife still stuck through his heart. It was a frightening display of stamina, the way the hunter stood with only the slightest wobbliness, before quickly shifting to the most exquisite combat stance. Harold and his indestructible brother Duncan, who still lay on the floor, backed away with a tinge of amazement in their eyes. With his right hand leveling his blade at the two brothers, Dee reached around to his back with his left. Grabbing the knife by the handle, he jerked it free, and yet the blade protruding from his chest seemed to go in precisely the opposite direction, pushing out further. For a heartbeat, Dee's expression seemed tinged with pain. 3 objects flew toward him: the Black Panther's head, its 4 quarters, and the hind quarters from which they'd been sliced. While the 2 halves of the torso each had a pair of legs, how the head had launched itself into the air was a mystery. Bearing fangs that grew long and curved like those of a saber-toothed tiger, the head made a huge turn in mid-air, bringing its jaws down toward the top of Dee's head. A flash of silver light ripped through the beast from its fang-filled upper jaw to the base of its snout, and Dee sailed through the air without a sound. His coat floated out to deflect both halves of the torso. A split second before the hunter landed, the world around him spun 180 degrees. The floor was above him, the ceiling below, and yet Dee was still on his way back toward the floor. An odd sensation struck Dee, completely upsetting his sense of equilibrium. Although gravity was pulling him down toward the ground, his senses were telling him exactly the opposite. "Kill him!" Harold shouted from horseback. The fangs and claws closed down on Dee from above, although to the hunter, it felt like they were coming from below. The teeth jutted from the severed upper jaw. There really weren't words to convey how bizarre it actually looked. In an incredible display of skill, Dee parried the attacks, and fell to his knees. Fresh blood dripped from his chest, staining the floor. "Your death in this world will mean death in reality," Dr. Allen said from somewhere unseen. And it was at that very moment that Dee's form warped. "No!" Dr. Allen screamed. But he wasn't alone. Harold B. cried the very same thing. The knife that had left his hand had gone through Dee's body and stuck in the wall. He vanished. Harold muttered in disbelief. A flash of silver had gone right past the end of his nose, knocking a crystal shard from the machine next to the bed. "Damnation!" Dr. Allen shouted. Harold's vicious gaze shifted to the bed with intense speed. Even after seeing the sorrowful visage of the beauty lying there, the beastly light didn't fade from his eyes. "What happened?" he asked. "Was it because the machine of yours started acting up?" "No," the director said, shaking his head. "It's not the machine's fault. Control of this world is shifting, you see, but it's essentially the same as if the device had been destroyed. What are you going to do?" Sounding very much like a curse, Duncan's question drifted up from the floor. He looked over the head of his panther, which had its snout sliced off, with eyes as red as blood and glaring at the hospital director. "If you just let him be, he's gonna see Sybil. And if that happens, we're finished," old Mrs. Sheldon said from the doorway. "If I were you, I'd be trying to come up with another way to stop that real fast. But it don't matter all that much to me." The old woman sounded easygoing, apathetic even, but her words made Dr. Allen knit his brow. "They're still away," he said. "Just you wait. Dream or not, a whole world is no easy thing to destroy." First part end.